A 4-year-old boy had never taken a single step in his life because of an incurable paralysis. When the cleaner brought her 7-year-old daughter to work at the mansion, the boy's millionaire father witnessed something so shocking it brought him to his knees. Leo's wheelchair sat empty in the garden, rocking gently in the warm afternoon breeze, like a ship abandoned adrift on a sea of perfectly manicured lawn. To anyone passing by the mansion's high iron gates, the scene would have been one of almost poetic tranquility. But for Richard, watching from the window of his lavish office, that object of metal and leather was a silent monument to his greatest pain. Inside, sitting on the plush living room rug, little Leo, just 4 years old, stretched his small arm with a determination that defied his fragile frame. His chubby fingers tried, unsuccessfully, to reach a red fire truck that had rolled under the sofa. He grunted, a sound of pure effort, his face contorting into an expression of intense frustration. Leo never cried at times like these. Instead, his blue eyes, inherited from the mother he barely knew, filled with a fierce stubbornness. He would try for hours if he had to. It was this strength that kept Richard's heart beating, but it was also this same strength that broke it every day. He saw his son's desperate desire to move, to explore, to be like the other children whose laughter he heard from a distance. Coming from the park across the street, the boy was a vibrant soul trapped in a body that would not obey. Richard looked away, feeling the familiar knot form in his throat. Money could buy the best wheelchair, the best doctors, the most accessible home, but it couldn't buy the freedom of a single step. The office door opened with a soft knock, and Elena, the housekeeper, entered holding a tray with a cup of coffee. Her eyes, always gentle and full of a silent understanding, landed first on Richard and then on the scene in the living room. She had worked there for nearly a decade, since before Leo was born. She had watched Laura's belly grow, witnessed the joy and then the fear. And when Laura was gone, leaving behind a shattered husband and a baby with a devastating diagnosis, it was Eleanor who became a pillar of stability in that grieving house. She placed the tray on the mahogany desk. "Mr. Richard," she began, her voice low and hesitant, a tone he rarely heard from her. "I need to ask you a favor, a very big favor." Richard turned, his melancholy replaced by concern. Elena never asked for anything. "What is it, Elena? What's wrong?" She was twisting a cleaning cloth in her hands, a clear sign of her nervousness. "It's my daughter, Sophia. Her school is closing for a week for emergency repairs, and I have no one to leave her with. I know this isn't the place, but I can't miss work." Richard considered it. His first instinct was to protect Leo's sacred, quiet routine. The house was a sanctuary, a cocoon. But then he remembered Elena in the first few months after losing Laura, brewing teas he wouldn't drink and ensuring that Leo, still an infant, was always warm and safe while he himself could barely get out of bed. Her loyalty was immeasurable. "Bring her," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "She can stay with you. Leo might even enjoy having another child around." Eleanor sighed, a relief so profound it seemed to empty all the air from her lungs. "Thank you, sir. You have no idea what this means." She retreated, leaving Richard once again with his thoughts. A girl, a 7-year-old girl, a stranger about to enter his meticulously controlled world. He looked at his son, who had finally given up on the truck and was now watching a bird perched on the window, his eyes filled with a pure wonder and a heart-wrenching vulnerability. The next day, an unknown and unpredictable force would cross the gate of that mansion, bringing with it the potential to heal or to finally break what was left of that family. The following morning arrived with a tense quiet, the mansion's silence feeling heavier, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Richard watched Leo play with his building blocks, the boy absorbed in constructing a tower that would inevitably collapse, a cycle of creation and frustration that mirrored his own life. The sound of the back doorbell rang promptly at 8 o'clock, and Richard's heart skipped a beat. It was Elena, and with her, little Sophia. He positioned himself discreetly at the living room doorway, where he could see the hall. Elena entered, and behind her, clinging to her skirt, was a girl with dark hair and large, curious eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the luxurious environment with a mixture of awe and shyness. She wore a simple cotton dress, printed with small flowers and well-worn sandals. Sophia was the opposite of that house, full of a simple, unadorned life, a stark contrast to the polished, silent opulence that surrounded her. "Stay here for a little bit, sweetie. Mommy will be right back," Elena whispered, before disappearing into the kitchen. Sophia stood still, her shoulders hunched, a small splash of color in a hallway of white marble and beige tones. Leo, from his chair, heard the unfamiliar voice and pushed his wheels to peer out. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was the first time Leo had seen a child inside his house who wasn't a distant cousin on a formal, supervised visit. Richard felt a tightness in his chest, an urge to intervene, to protect Leo from the inevitable pity or awkwardness that always came from others, but he forced himself to stay put. Sophia slowly let go of her mother's skirt and took a hesitant step toward the living room. She stopped at a safe distance, her eyes fixed not on Leo, but on the wheelchair. She tilted her head like a curious little bird. Leo flinched, waiting for the question that never came, or worse, the uncomfortable silence. But Sophia wasn't like the others. "Why do you sit in that chair?" she asked, her voice clear and without a trace of pity. The question was so direct, so disarmed of any prejudice, that it took both Leo and Richard by surprise. Elena, returning from the kitchen, froze, her face pale with worry. Leo blinked. He was used to whispers, averted gazes, to adults saying, "Don't point, it's not polite." No one had ever just asked. He looked down at his own legs and shrugged. "Because my legs don't work," he answered, with the same simplicity. Sophia seemed to consider this information for a second, her eyes serious. Then she nodded, as if it were the most logical explanation in the world. To her, it was just a fact, not a tragedy. Her gaze then swept across the garden through the enormous glass door. Outside, a colorful soccer ball rested on the grass. A smile lit up her face. She turned to Leo, her eyes shining with an idea. "Then let's go play outside," she said, pointing. "We can kick the ball." Eleanor brought a hand to her mouth, ready to scold her daughter for her insensitivity. Richard felt a pang of pain at the cruel innocence of the suggestion. But Leo didn't look offended. He looked confused. Kick the ball. No one had ever suggested that to him. It was a universe of possibilities that had always been denied to him. The girl, seeing the hesitation on his face, took another step forward, her initial shyness completely forgotten, replaced by a contagious enthusiasm. She held out her small hand to him, a gesture of pure conviction. "Come on," she said, with a firmness surprising for her age. "But I'll help you." Time seemed to freeze in that instant. Sophia's small hand, extended in the air, was a bridge between two worlds, Leo's world, defined by limits of metal and rubber, and Sophia's, where imagination knew no barriers. Richard felt an impulse to intervene, to gently explain that Leo couldn't kick a ball, that his legs didn't work that way. Elena took a step forward, her face contorted in apology, ready to reprimand her daughter and end the awkward moment. But Leo's reaction stopped them. He didn't shrink back or look hurt. Instead, his blue eyes were fixed on Sophia's hand, and then on the colorful ball glowing under the garden sun. A whirlwind of unknown emotions crossed his small face. Surprise, curiosity, and something Richard hadn't seen in a very long time. A flicker of longing. It was the desire not to have what he couldn't, but to simply try. Sophia, sensing the hesitation, didn't withdraw her hand. She smiled, a genuine grin that lit up her dark eyes. "Don't worry, she said with the wisdom of an old soul. "My grandma always said there are 1,000 ways to do the same thing." With that, she lowered her hand and, instead of insisting, ran into the garden. She grabbed the ball and came back, sitting cross-legged on the grass, right in front of Leo's wheelchair. She placed the ball between them. "There," she announced. "The game is like this. I push it to you, and you push it back to me. With your hands, it's our kind of soccer." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. It was so simple, so obvious, and yet in 4 years, no one had ever thought of it. All the therapists, the specialists, the well-meaning relatives, they all focused on what Leo couldn't do. Sophia, in less than 10 minutes, had focused on what he could. Leo looked at his father, then at Elena, seeking permission. Richard just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. With a hesitant movement, Leo pushed the ball with the palm of his hand. It rolled awkwardly across the grass and stopped at Sophia's feet. "Yes, my turn," she exclaimed, pushing it back. Soon, a rhythm was established. The soft sound of the ball rolling on the grass was the only thing that broke the silence, punctuated by Sophia's occasional giggles and Leo's shy but increasingly frequent smiles. Elena watched, silent tears streaming down her face. She saw her daughter not with the naivety of a child, but with a compassion that seemed to come from a much deeper source. Richard leaned against the doorframe, feeling the weight of years of sadness begin to yield, millimeter by millimeter. He had built a fortress to protect his son from the world's pain, but perhaps, without realizing it, he had built a prison. Sophia was the first crack of light to penetrate those walls. After a few minutes of play, the ball rolled slightly to the side, out of Leo's reach. He stretched his arm, but couldn't get it. The familiar frustration flashed in his eyes. "I can't," he murmured, his voice small. Sophia stopped smiling and looked at him seriously. "My grandma used to say, 'I can't' is just a story we tell ourselves when we're scared to try," she said, repeating the words like a sacred mantra. She said our body listens to what our heart says. If your heart says try, your body tries too. She stood up, got the ball, and placed it back in Leo's hands. Their fingers touched for an instant. The contact was brief, but for Leo, it was as if a small spark of warmth had traveled up his arm. He looked at his own legs, still and pale, and then back at Sophia's smiling face. For the first time, the question in his mind was not, "Why can't I?" but a new, terrifying possibility that the girl's words had planted in his heart. "What if I could?" The days that followed transformed the mansion. The solemn silence was replaced by a constant hum of activity. Sophia's laughter echoed through the marble hallways, and the sounds of Leo's wheelchair wheels became faster, more urgent, as he tried to keep up with his new friend's boundless energy. Sophia didn't see the chair as a barrier, but as an accessory. They turned it into a race car, a pirate ship, and even a spaceship on a mission to Mars, which was Richard's prize-winning rose garden. For him, watching the two of them was like watching a movie in a language he didn't understand, but whose emotional plot completely captivated him. He saw his son, who once spent hours in silent contemplation, now engaged in imaginary conversations with pirates and aliens. The vulnerability in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a glint of adventure. During one particularly warm afternoon, while Eleanor was cleaning the library, the two children were sitting in the shade of an old oak tree in the garden. Leo was fascinated by how Sophia created little dolls from leaves and twigs. She worked with intense concentration, her tongue stuck between her teeth. "Who taught you how to do that?" Leo asked, gently touching one of the creations. Sophia looked up, a nostalgic smile on her lips. "My grandma. She could make anything from things in nature. She said the earth has a special magic, that it can heal anything if we ask with our hearts." The grandmother's name came up often in Sophia's conversations. She spoke of her not as someone who was gone, but as a constant presence, a source of wisdom and strength. "Could she heal me too?" Leo asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with a hope he hardly dared to feel. Sophia stopped working and looked at Leo's legs. Her eyes held no pity, only a deep thoughtfulness. She used to say that healing doesn't come from the outside, it comes from within. We just need someone to help wake it up. She leaned closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a state secret. She taught me a prayer, a special prayer. She said, if you pray with lots and lots of faith, mountains will move. Leo looked at his own legs. To him, they were mountains, immovable, heavy, insurmountable. The idea that something as simple as words could move them seemed like a fairy tale, but coming from Sophia, it sounded like the purest truth. That night, Richard went to give Leo a goodnight kiss. The boy was quiet, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Dad," he called, his voice soft. "What's faith?" Richard was caught off guard. They weren't a religious family. Science and medicine had been their only gods for the past 4 years, and cruel gods at that, for the most part. "Faith, son, is believing in something you can't see," he answered, choosing his words carefully. Leo turned his face to look at him, his blue eyes shining in the dim light. "Sophia has a lot of faith. She believes mountains can move." Richard felt a chill. He didn't want to give his son false hope. The path of disappointment was one he knew all too well. "Well, sometimes faith helps us be strong, to face difficult things," he said, trying to be pragmatic. But Leo didn't seem satisfied with the answer. He seemed to be holding a secret, a seed of hope that Sophia's words had planted and that was now beginning to sprout in the fertile soil of his childhood imagination. The next day, Sophia's week at the mansion was coming to an end. The prospect of returning to silence filled Richard with an unexpected melancholy. As he watched the children in the garden, he saw Sophia take both of Leo's hands. She closed her eyes and her lips began to move silently. Leo watched her, his face serious and focused. Richard couldn't hear what she was saying, but he could feel the intensity of the moment, even from a distance. It was as if the two children were in their own world, sharing something sacred. Suddenly, Leo let out a low cry, a mixture of shock and amazement. His eyes widened, and he looked down at his own legs with an expression of absolute disbelief. Sophia opened her eyes, her face lit by a triumphant smile. Richard felt his heart race. What had happened? He started walking toward them, an icy fear running through his veins. Leo looked up at his father, and on his face was not pain, but a whispered miracle. "Dad," he said, his voice trembling. "I felt it. I felt a tingling." Leo's words hung in the air, charged with impossible weight. "I felt a tingling." To Richard, the phrase sounded like an echo from a parallel universe, a reality that science and logic had taught him to dismiss. His first instinct was skepticism, protection. It could just be a child's imagination, suggestible from his friend's intensity. He knelt in front of his son, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What did you feel, Leo? Where?" he asked, his voice controlled, trying to mask the storm of emotions raging inside him. Leo pointed to his right calf. "Here." It felt like a bunch of tiny ants walking inside. It tickled. His eyes were huge, an ocean of wonder and discovery. Sophia, beside him, nodded affirmatively, as if this were the most expected outcome in the world. "I told you," she whispered to Leo, a secret shared between them. "It's your grandma's magic," he replied, his voice full of awe. Elena, who had approached upon hearing the boy's cry, looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She knew the stories of her mother, the folk healer from the small village where she grew up, but she had always seen them as folklore, tales to comfort the afflicted. To see them manifest here in this lavish garden, before her very eyes, was unnerving. Richard touched Leo's leg. It was warm, but that wasn't unusual. He massaged it gently. "Do you still feel anything?" Leo shook his head. "No, it's gone now." The disappointment in his voice was palpable, and that hurt Richard more than the skepticism. Hope was a dangerous flame. It could warm the soul, but it could also burn with a cruel pain when it was extinguished. That night, Richard called Dr. Miller, Leo's neurologist. He reported the incident, feeling foolish as he did so. The doctor's response was predictable, calm, rational. "Richard, it's likely a phantom sensation or a psychosomatic response. The girl's presence, the emotional intensity, all of that can create sensations that feel real. We'll keep an eye on it, but let's not build up expectations." Richard hung up, feeling torn. His mind agreed with the doctor, but his heart, treacherously, clung to the image of his son's shocked face. The next day was Sophia's last at the mansion. A sense of farewell hung over their games. They were quieter, as if trying to treasure every moment. In the middle of the afternoon, while Richard was on a conference call in his office, the children found a secret hiding spot behind a dense azalea bush. "We have to try again," Sophia said with urgency. "Before I go." Leo nodded, fear and hope warring in his chest. What if it didn't happen again? What if Dr. Miller was right? Sophia took his hands again. "Close your eyes," she instructed, "and think of the thing you want most in the world. Think about running on this grass. Feel the wind on your face." Leo obeyed. He imagined it with all the force of his 4-year-old soul. He imagined himself leaving the chair, his legs moving, running toward his father, who was waiting with open arms. He felt hot tears stream down his cheeks, even with his eyes closed. Sophia began to whisper the prayer again, her words a soft murmur, like the buzzing of a bee. This time, the tingling returned, stronger, climbing up both legs. Leo gasped. "It's happening!" he whispered. "Sophia, it's happening again!" "Don't open your eyes," she commanded. "Now, try to move your big toe, just your toe. Grandma said everything starts with a step as small as an ant's." Leo focused, channeling all his energy, all his hope, into that single point of his body. He furrowed his brow, sweat beading on his forehead. Nothing. He tried again, frustration mounting. "I can't," he said, his voice choked. "Yes, you can," Sophia insisted. "Your heart wants to. Let your body listen." Driven by her unshakable faith, Leo gave one last mental push. And then, inside his sneaker, he felt it. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement, a twitch. His right big toe had moved. He snapped his eyes open, breathless, his heart pounding. He looked at Sophia, his eyes wide with triumph. They didn't shout. They didn't make a scene. Instead, they shared a look of deep complicity. This was their secret, a small, fragile miracle they needed to protect from the skeptical world of adults. "We won't tell anyone yet," Sophia whispered, her voice full of a wisdom far beyond her 7 years. "We'll keep our secret until it gets really strong." Sophia's departure left a vacuum in the mansion. The silence Richard once cherished now felt oppressive. Haunted by the echo of laughter that was no longer there, Leo went back to being a quiet boy, but something fundamental had changed. His eyes no longer reflected a passive acceptance of his fate. Now they held a secret flame, a purpose that burned within him. Every night, after Richard tucked him into bed, Leo practiced. Under the dim light of his moon-shaped lamp, he would close his eyes and concentrate, trying to recreate the tingling sensation, trying to command his sleeping muscles. It was exhausting, mentally draining work. Most of the time, nothing happened. Frustration brought him to the verge of tears, and doubt, like a cold shadow, crept into his thoughts. Maybe it had all been a dream. Maybe the magic only worked when Sophia was there, but then he would remember her gaze, the firmness in her voice. "Yes, you can." And he would try again. A week passed. Elena continued her work with the same quiet efficiency, but Richard noticed she watched Leo with a renewed intensity, a mix of hope and fear in her eyes. She knew her daughter had planted something in the boy, but she didn't know if the seed would take root or die. One day, while cleaning Leo's room, she found him sitting on his bed, brow furrowed in concentration, eyes squeezed shut. She paused at the door, not daring to interrupt. She saw the bedsheet move slightly over his foot. It was a movement so subtle, she almost thought she'd imagined it. But then, it happened again. A small twitch, a tremor of life, where before there had only been stillness. Elena brought a hand to her heart, feeling it flutter. It wasn't her imagination. It was real. She backed away silently, closing the door with care. The secret wasn't just the children's anymore. Now it was hers too. By the end of the second week, Leo had achieved a new victory. After nearly an hour of concentration, he managed not only to move his toes, but to flex his ankle. It was a jerky, uncontrolled movement, but it was unequivocally a movement. The joy that flooded him was so overwhelming he almost shouted. Instead, he hugged his teddy bear tightly, sharing his triumph with his only confidant. He had to tell Sophia. During breakfast the next day, he made a request to his father. "Dad, can we call Elena? I want to talk to Sophia." Richard was surprised. Leo rarely asked to talk to anyone. "Of course, son." He picked up his phone and dialed Elena's number. When Sophia answered, Leo's voice was an excited whisper. He didn't go into detail, aware his father was listening, but used a code only they understood. Sophia, the little bird. It moved its wing. On the other end of the line, there was a muffled squeal of joy. "I knew it," her voice came back, vibrating with happiness. "Keep practicing. Grandma said that after it moves its wing, it will soon learn to fly." The conversation gave Leo the encouragement he needed. That afternoon, feeling braver than ever, he tried something new. Using his arms to brace himself on the side of the bed, he focused on contracting the muscles in his thighs. He remembered Sophia's voice, the warmth of her hands, the unwavering faith in her eyes. He pushed, not just with his muscles, but with every fiber of his being, with all the force of his will. And then the impossible happened. With a groan of effort, Leo managed to push himself up, supporting himself on his arms, and stand on his trembling legs for 3 whole seconds before collapsing back onto the bed, breathless and exhausted. 3 seconds. To the world, it was the blink of an eye. To Leo, it was an eternity. It was proof that the mountain could, indeed, be moved. He lay there, his heart thundering, sweat dripping down his face, but a smile of pure, exultant victory on his lips. He needed to get stronger. He needed to practice more. He wanted to surprise Sophia and his dad. He would keep the secret, guard this miracle in his heart, until the moment he could not just stand, but take a step. The bedroom door opened. Richard came in, carrying a glass of juice. He found his son lying down, his face flushed and panting. "Everything okay?" "Champ, you look tired." Leo just smiled, an enigmatic grin. "I was just dreaming, Dad," he said, his voice hoarse from the effort. "Dreaming I could fly." The third week of the secret was the hardest, and at the same time, the most rewarding. Communication between Leo and Sophia became a daily ritual, an exchange of coded whispers over the phone that fueled the flame of their shared determination. The little bird tried to flap its wings today, but it's still a little scared of the wind, Leo would say, and Sophia would reply with new words of wisdom from her grandmother, antidotes for fear and fatigue. Leo practiced relentlessly, turning his room into a secret gym. He used the edge of his bed, the low dresser, any firm surface to support himself and try to stand. His legs, once inert, now responded with tremors and spasms. Each reawakened muscle was a silent victory, an invisible medal in his small, a brave journey. He could now stand for almost a minute, as long as he was holding on tight. The next step, literally, was the most terrifying, letting go. At the end of that week, Richard, noticing a persistent melancholy in Leo, had an idea. He called Elena. Elena, I know it's your weekend, but I'd like to invite you and Sophia to spend Saturday here. As friends, Leo misses her. The invitation, so out of character, left Elena speechless, but she accepted with a heart full of gratitude. Sophia's arrival was like the sun breaking through the clouds. The joy of their reunion was so pure and contagious that even Richard found himself smiling without realizing it. The two children ran, or rather Leo rolled in his chair with impressive speed, to the garden, the stage of their budding miracle. There, hidden by their accomplices, the azalea bushes, the real work began. Today you're going to take a step, Sophia decreed, with the authority of a general. I'll hold you. You won't fall. Leo, his heart hammering against his ribs, supported himself on her shoulders. His legs trembled violently, protesting the unprecedented effort. I can't, Sophia. I'm too heavy. Nonsense, she retorted. You're light as a feather. Think about the little bird. It doesn't think about its weight. It just thinks about flying. Leo took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and thought about flying. He lifted his right foot. For a fraction of a second, all his weight was on his left leg. He moved his foot forward, a tiny distance, and placed it back on the ground. It was clumsy, wobbly, imperfect, but it was a step. Tears of joy and relief streamed down both their faces, and they hugged, tumbling onto the soft grass in a tangle of laughter and sobs. At that very moment, miles away, Richard ended his meeting early. A strange feeling, an inexplicable urge to be home, had overcome him. He drove faster than usual, eager for the sound of laughter that now warmed his house. As he entered, the quiet greeted him. He called for Elena but got no answer. He went to the glass door and looked out at the garden, and his world stopped. Leo's wheelchair was there, near the patio, empty. A blind, primal panic seized him. His mind raced, conjuring terrible images. Did he fall? Did someone take him? He ran into the garden, his heart a runaway drum in his chest. "Leo! Leo!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with dread. No sound, just the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves. Desperate, he began to search every corner, fear turning every shadow into a threat. That's when he heard it, a faint, almost inaudible sound, a giggle. It was coming from behind the large azalea bush. With his heart in his throat, he approached and pushed aside the flowering branches. The scene that revealed itself to him broke every law of reality he knew. Leo was standing, unsupported, in the middle of a small circle of grass. In front of him, Sophia was rolling the colorful ball toward him, and Leo, with a smile of pure concentration, lifted his leg and kicked the ball back to her. The movement unbalanced him, and he fell sitting on the grass. But there was no pain or frustration on his face, only the purest, most radiant joy. Richard stood paralyzed, the branches trembling in his hand. His eyes couldn't believe what they were seeing. His brain refused to process the image. It couldn't be real. It had to be a mirage, a cruel hallucination forged by his deepest desire. Richard's world tilted on its axis. The sounds of the garden seemed distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. His breath caught in his lungs. The children, absorbed in their game, hadn't noticed him yet. He watched Leo, with Sophia's help, get up again, his legs shaky but holding. A bubbling laugh escaped his son, a sound Richard had never heard before. The laugh of physical achievement, of a body moving by its own will. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. He let go of the branches, which snapped back into place, concealing the miraculous scene. Richard retreated. Step by step, his mind spinning wildly. Reality and illusion were merging. He stumbled back into the house, leaning against the cold glass wall, trying to force air into his lungs. He needed proof. He needed logic. He ran to his office, his hands shaking so badly he could barely type the password on his computer. He pulled up the footage from the garden security camera, the one he'd installed to monitor Leo. With his heart in his mouth, He rewound the recording of the last few minutes, and there it was, in grainy black and white but undeniable. The empty wheelchair, the two of them getting up, the step, the kick, the soft fall onto the grass, the laughter. It was real. The emotion that hit him wasn't pure joy, as he had always imagined it would be. It was a complex and overwhelming cocktail: astonishment, euphoria, fear, confusion, and, to his own surprise, a pang of shame. His son was walking, and he didn't know. The secret wasn't his. The victory wasn't his. He had been an outsider, a spectator, while a 7-year-old girl and her simple faith had achieved what his fortune and science could not. He scanned through the video, watching the interaction between them. He saw the encouragement in Sophia's eyes, the determination on Leo's face. He saw the complicity, the absolute trust. He realized this wasn't just about legs that moved. It was about hearts that had connected in a way he, with all his protective love, had never managed. When he finally felt able to face reality, he went back to the garden. This time, he made noise as he approached, coughing lightly. The children turned, their faces suddenly serious, caught in their secret act. Leo was sitting on the grass, trying to look as natural as possible. But the grass stains on his knees and the sparkle in his eyes betrayed him. Richard approached slowly, his heart still pounding. He knelt on the grass in front of Leo, ignoring the way it stained his expensive slacks. He didn't say, "I saw you." He didn't say, "How is this possible?" Instead, he looked into his son's eyes, truly seeing him for the first time in a long while, not as a patient or a victim, but as a boy of unimaginable strength. "Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You look happy." Leo glanced at Sophia, who gave him a small nod. It was time. With a deep breath, Leo replied, "I am happy, Dad, because I can do this." With fierce concentration, he placed his hands on the grass, planted his feet, and slowly, his legs trembling like saplings, he pushed himself up. He stood there, swaying, but standing right in front of his father. Hot, silent tears began to roll down Richard's face. They were tears of shock, of joy, of a relief so profound it seemed to undo knots he'd been carrying for years. He reached out, not to help, but simply to touch his son's shoulder, to feel the solid reality of that moment, to be sure he wasn't dreaming. Leo, seeing his father's tears, took a hesitant step toward him, and another, and then he was in Richard's arms, hugging him with a force that knocked him back onto the grass. The two of them laughing and crying at the same time, while Sophia and Elena, who had come over, watched the scene, their own faces wet with tears. The miracle was no longer a secret. The news spread like wildfire, first within the mansion's walls, then, inevitably, to the outside world. Richard's initial euphoria gave way to a wave of pragmatism. He scheduled an emergency appointment with Dr. Miller and a team of specialists. He needed answers, scientific explanations for the miracle that had bloomed in his garden. The day of the appointment was tense. Leo, holding tightly to his father's hand on one side and Sophia's on the other, walked down the polished clinic hallway. His steps were still hesitant, his gait a bit unsteady, but each one was an open challenge to years of grim prognoses. In the examination room, the doctors watched, dumbfounded. They had him walk, squat, even try a small jump. They ran a battery of tests, MRIs, nerve conduction studies. The results were inexplicable. The scans showed the same spinal cord lesions that had always been there. Science said he shouldn't be able to walk, and yet, there he was. "It's an unprecedented, spontaneous remission," Dr. Miller said, rubbing his forehead, his expression a mixture of awe and utter bewilderment. "From a medical standpoint, what we're seeing is impossible. Perhaps an extreme neuroplastic response triggered by a powerful emotional or psychological stimulus." The word psychosomatic was whispered among the other doctors. The veiled suggestion was that Leo's condition might never have been so severe, that his paralysis could have had a psychological component that Sophia's presence had somehow unlocked. This idea was a thorn in Richard's heart. It suggested that he, somehow, had failed to provide the right stimulus for his son. The doctors' skepticism was the first major hurdle. They viewed the recovery with suspicion, warning it could be temporary. "We need to be cautious," Dr. Miller advised. "We don't want to create false hope for a complete and permanent recovery." But Leo didn't care about their cautious words. He had Sophia, and her faith was more powerful than any diagnosis. While the doctors debated, the two children played in the corner of the room, building a tower with the office's wooden blocks. Their simple, joyful presence was a living refutation of all the adults' complex skepticism. The story, however, leaked to the press. A nurse, awestruck by what he'd seen, told a journalist friend. Within days, the mansion was surrounded by reporters and onlookers. "The miracle boy!" the headlines blared. The narrative was sensationalized, focusing on Richard's wealth and the mysterious recovery. And then the attention turned to the little girl healer. The questions became more invasive, more cynical. Who was she? Where did she come from? What methods had she used? Influential figures in the medical and skeptical communities began to raise questions. Television shows debated the case, with experts warning of the dangers of unscientific treatments and the exploitation of credulity. The pure faith and unconditional love that had worked the miracle were being twisted into something suspicious, something to be investigated. Elena found herself at the center of a storm she didn't understand. She was a simple woman, and now she was being hounded with questions about her daughter's practices. She felt terrified, protective. Inside the house, the dynamic also began to shift. Agnes, the head housekeeper, a woman who had worked for the family for years and always maintained a rigid and somewhat resentful demeanor, watched the growing closeness between Richard, Elena, and the children with corrosive jealousy. She saw Richard's gratitude toward Elena transform into a deep affection and respect, a position she, Agnes, had always coveted. In her eyes, Elena was no longer the housekeeper. She was a usurper, a woman who, through some trick with her daughter, had won her employer's heart. Envy began to plant poisonous seeds in her mind. She saw how Richard now included Elena and Sophia in dinners, how he asked for their opinions, how he treated them as part of the family, and she decided it had to stop. The world outside was questioning the miracle, and now a far more dangerous threat was beginning to germinate silently within the mansion's own walls. The fourth week arrived like a hurricane, not of joy, but of intrigue and suspicion. Agnes, the head housekeeper, moved through the mansion like a shadow, her sharp eyes recording every interaction, every shared smile between Richard and Elena's family. The jealousy that consumed her was not just professional, it was deeply personal. She saw herself as the guardian of the memory of Laura, Richard's late wife, and in her distorted view, Elena's rise was a betrayal of that memory. She had to find a way to restore the natural order of things, to put Elena back in her place. The opportunity arose subtly. One day, while tidying Leo's room, Agnes found a small cloth sachet, tied with a red ribbon, hidden under the boy's pillow. Inside was a mix of dried herbs and a small, smooth stone. To anyone else, it would be a child's treasure, likely a gift from Sophia. To Agnes, it was the proof she needed. She photographed the sachet with her phone, her mind already weaving a sinister narrative. Later that afternoon, she overheard Sophia telling Leo how her grandmother used herbal teas to cure stomachaches. With her phone's voice recorder discreetly activated in her apron pocket, she captured the innocent conversation, which, out of context, could sound as if Sophia were administering homemade remedies to the boy. With her evidence in hand, Agnes began her smear campaign. She didn't go to Richard directly. She was far too clever for that. She started with whispers to the household staff, planting seeds of doubt. "Don't you find all of this strange? Suddenly the boy is walking, and that woman and her daughter are always around with their stories and things." She would show the photo of the sachet, insinuating it could be spells or dangerous remedies. The rumor, like a poisonous weed, began to take root. The staff, who once respected Elena, now looked at her with suspicion. Whispers would stop when she entered a room. The atmosphere in the mansion, once light and hopeful, became heavy and charged with suspicion. The major turning point came when Agnes, feeling the ground was prepared, decided to take her conspiracy to a higher level. She made an anonymous call to Child Protective Services in a voice disguised with concern. She reported that a child undergoing a miraculous recovery was being subjected to unsupervised alternative treatments by the housekeeper's daughter, guided by the questionable beliefs of a folk healer grandmother. She mentioned herbs, prayers, and the doctor's refusal to endorse the recovery as purely scientific. "I'm just worried for the boy's well-being," she concluded, a note of false emotion in her voice. 2 days later, 2 social workers, a man and a woman with serious expressions and clipboards, rang the mansion's doorbell. Richard received them in his office, completely bewildered. They explained they had received an anonymous tip and were obligated to investigate allegations that Leo's health could be at risk. Richard was livid. "This is absurd. My son has never been better. He's thriving," he protested, but the social workers were impassive. The law was clear. They had to interview everyone involved, including the children. The questioning was a nightmare. Leo, frightened by the formality of the situation, could barely speak. Sophia, when asked about her grandmother and the prayers, answered with the innocence of a child. But her words about magic and faith that moves mountains were written down with a seriousness that twisted them into something sinister. When Eleanor was called in, she found herself cornered, trying to defend her family's traditions, which were now being painted as dangerous charlatanism. Agnes, when interviewed, played the part of the loyal, concerned employee, reluctantly sharing her observations and showing the photo of the herbal sachet. The climax of the investigation came when the social workers asked to speak with Leo alone. Faced with the pressure and confusion, the boy admitted that Sophia sometimes gave him little teas, referring to the mint leaf water they drank during their playhouse games. To the investigators' ears, it sounded like a confirmation of the allegations. The decision was swift and devastating. "Until the investigation is concluded," the female social worker announced, "to ensure the child's safety, Mrs. Elena and her daughter are to have no further contact with the boy." Leo. The sentence fell like a blade, severing the bond that had healed the incurable. Leo's world collapsed. The social worker's verdict was carried out with a bureaucratic coldness that allowed for no emotional appeals. Richard, though furious and feeling powerless, was advised by his lawyers to cooperate fully to avoid even worse legal complications. The goodbye was swift, brutal, and silent, conducted in the grand foyer under the watchful eyes of the social workers and the falsely compassionate gaze of Agnes. Sophia and Leo couldn't hug, they just looked at each other. And in that look, a universe of unspoken promises and broken hearts was shared. Elena, with a dignity that defied the humiliation she was enduring, took her daughter's hand and turned, never looking back. The mansion door closed, the click of the lock echoing like a gunshot, sealing their separation. Richard, devastated by the injustice, felt rage bubble inside him. He looked at Agnes, who was discreetly dabbing at a fake tear. "I hope you're satisfied, Agnes," he said, his voice like ice. The housekeeper just lowered her head, playing her part as a concerned servant. In the days that followed, the mansion plunged into a darkness deeper than any that had existed before Sophia's arrival. Leo refused to leave his room. The wheelchair, which had been relegated to a corner like a trophy from a won battle, was brought back out. The boy wouldn't talk, wouldn't eat properly. The light in his eyes, which had shone so brightly, had gone out, replaced by a hollow, profound sadness. The devastating subplot began to unfold with a silent cruelty. Without Sophia's encouraging presence, without the shared faith that fueled his strength, Leo began to falter. Literally, his steps, once growing steadier, became hesitant. One day, trying to get from his bed to the window, his legs gave out and he fell to the soft rug. The fall didn't hurt him physically, but the impact on his spirit was catastrophic. The fear that Sophia had helped banish returned with a vengeance. He began to refuse to even try to walk, preferring the familiar safety of his chair. Richard, panicking, called Dr. Miller. The doctor examined Leo and delivered his opinion with an air of melancholy confirmation. As I feared, Richard, the recovery was tied to a strong psychological component, the emotional stress of the separation. It's caused a regression. He's losing confidence in his own body. To the doctors, it was proof of their theory. To Richard, it was the confirmation of his worst nightmare. But to Leo, the reason was much simpler. He had lost his magic. He had lost the person who believed in him more than he believed in himself. Meanwhile, Elena was facing her own hell. Suspended from work, her reputation tarnished, she fought to keep her head up for Sophia. The girl, though heartbroken, showed a surprising resilience. "Don't worry, Mom," she would say, hugging her mother. "Grandma used to say, the truth is like the sun. It can hide behind the clouds for a while, but it never stops shining." The investigation dragged on, and the evidence fabricated by Agnes seemed conclusive to bureaucrats who saw only reports, not people. Agnes, for her part, savored her victory. She had restored order, removed the threat. She now tried to get closer to Richard, offering comfort, preparing his favorite meals, attempting to fill the void Elena had left. But Richard saw her with a cold revulsion. Something about the whole situation didn't add up. The anonymous tip, the convenient proof. A seed of suspicion began to sprout in his mind. He was consumed by guilt. He had allowed envy and malice to enter his home and destroy the most precious thing his son had ever had. One night, unable to sleep, Richard was in his office, reviewing security camera footage, searching for something, anything he might have missed. On an impulse, he decided to look not at the garden footage, but at the recordings from the interior hallways from the days leading up to the report. He spent hours watching the routine, the movements of the staff, and then he saw it. The image showed Agnes, standing at Leo's bedroom door, peering in. She thought no one was watching. In her hand, she held her phone, and on the screen, the interface of a voice recording app was clearly visible. Richard's blood ran cold. He fast-forwarded the video and found another scene. Agnes, late at night, in the hallway, making a phone call. The camera didn't capture the sound, but her body language, the furtive glances to either side, the look of smug satisfaction on her face when she hung up, left no doubt. It was her. The anonymous tip wasn't anonymous. The truth, like the sun Sophia spoke of, was about to break through the clouds, and its light would be unforgiving. The night brought Richard no sleep. It brought clarity, a cold, sharp clarity that filled him not just with anger, but with a deep, overwhelming shame. The proof was there, flashing on his computer screen, a digital testament to the malice he had allowed to fester under his own roof. Every frame of the video was a stab to his father's heart. Sophia's innocence being twisted, his son's trust being used as a weapon, Elena's loyalty being trampled, and he, blinded by his own grief and the authority he had delegated, had seen nothing. At dawn, he wasn't tired. He was energized by a new, unshakable resolve. He summoned the entire household staff to the grand foyer, an unprecedented act. When Agnes came down the stairs, her face composed in a mask of efficiency, she found all her colleagues gathered, looking at her with curiosity. Richard was standing next to a large television he'd had installed during the night. He said nothing. He just picked up the remote and pressed play. The first image to appear was of Agnes in the hallway, recording the children's conversation. A murmur went through the room. The next scene was even more damning. The camera from Leo's room showed her, on a day prior to the report, slipping the small sachet of herbs under the boy's pillow. The proof wasn't something she found. It was something she planted. The final blow was the video of her in the hallway on the phone, the triumphant smirk on her face as she reported her lies. The silence in the foyer was absolute, broken only by the shocked gasps of the staff. Agnes's face crumbled, draining from pale white to blotchy red in seconds. She began, her voice a pathetic squeak. Richard held up a hand, silencing her. His voice, and when he spoke, was low, controlled, but weighted with an icy fury. Your envy and your poison nearly destroyed my son's only chance at happiness. You're fired. I want you out of this house in 1 hour. He turned away, not giving her a second glance. Without wasting a moment, Richard grabbed his car keys and drove, not to his office, but to the modest neighborhood where Elena lived. He found the small, neat apartment and knocked on the door, his heart pounding. When Elena opened it, her face showed surprise, then a wary pain. Before she could say anything, Richard spoke, the words tumbling out in a torrent of remorse. Elena, I'm so sorry. I was blind. I was a fool. I know everything. It was Agnes. I have the proof. I fired her. But none of that matters. He paused, his voice cracking. What matters is that I failed you. I failed Sophia, and most of all, I failed my son. He's not walking anymore, Elena. The light has gone out. Please, I'm begging you, come back. Leo needs you. The tears he had held back for so long finally streamed down his face. Elena, seeing the genuine pain in this broken man, felt her own heart soften. She called for Sophia, and the journey back to the mansion was made in a silence charged with hope and apprehension. Richard brought Sophia straight to Leo's room. The boy was in his chair, his back to the door, watching the light rain that had started to fall outside. Leo, Richard called softly. Leo turned his head, his eyes listless. But then he saw who was standing behind his father. His eyes widened. A breath of life seemed to run through his body. Sophia, he whispered, his voice weak, as if seeing a ghost. Sophia said nothing. She just ran to him. Leo reached out with trembling hands, and the moment their fingers touched, something seemed to crackle in the air. He looked down at his own legs, as if he'd felt a shock. With his eyes locked on Sophia's, he gripped the arms of his wheelchair. With a groan that was part effort, part miracle, he pushed himself up. His legs shook, threatened to buckle, but they held. He was standing. And in the emotional silence of the room, under his father's awestruck gaze, Leo took a second step, walking not just with his legs, but with the strength of a reunion that had given him back his soul. The reunion was the spark that relit the fire. The strength didn't return to Leo's legs all at once, but Sophia's return was the catalyst that reawakened his will to fight. The sadness that had paralyzed him dissipated like mist in the morning sun. That very afternoon, the two were in the garden, hand in hand, relearning how to walk, how to run, how to live. Richard watched, his heart overflowing with a gratitude so intense it was almost painful. He wasn't just witnessing his son's physical recovery, he was witnessing the healing of his own soul. The next day, armed with the irrefutable video evidence, Richard and his lawyers went to the Child Protective Services Agency. The meeting was brief. Faced with proof of tampering and false testimony, the case against Elena was immediately dismissed with a formal, embarrassed apology. The manipulative housekeeper, Agnes, faced the consequences of her actions. Beyond the humiliating dismissal, Richard filed a formal complaint against her for slander and defamation, ensuring her malice would not go unpunished and that she could not harm another family. The resolution of her arc was not violent, but a just application of the law, leaving her isolated and her professional reputation in ruins. With the clouds of suspicion finally cleared, Richard could focus on what truly mattered: rebuilding his family. He sat with Elena in the library, the place she used to quietly clean, and made her a proposal that would change their lives forever. "Elena," he began, his voice firm but full of humility, "I don't want you to be my housekeeper anymore. I want you to be Leo's official caregiver. More than that, I want you and Sophia to be part of this family, not as employees, but as family. This house is as much yours as it is mine." Eleanor, with tears in her eyes, accepted. It wasn't about money or status, but about recognition, about belonging. It was the validation that the love and dedication she had given this house for so many years was, in fact, her most valuable asset. The family dynamic transformed. The formal silence was replaced by dinner-table conversations, by impromptu movie nights in the living room, by the constant sound of children's laughter echoing through the halls. Sophia was given a room next to Leo's, and their games no longer had to end when the day was over. They became siblings of the heart, inseparable in their adventures. The subplot about Sophia's grandmother found its beautiful resolution when, one day, Elena brought out an old photo album to show Richard. Among the yellowed pictures was one of her mother, a woman with kind eyes and a wise smile, surrounded by people from her village who looked at her with gratitude. "She was a healer," Elena explained, her voice full of a rediscovered pride. People would come from all over for her to pray for them. She didn't use magic, Mr. Richard. She used faith. She had a gift for waking up the healing that's already inside people. Richard looked out at Sophia, who was teaching Leo how to jump rope in the garden. He understood. Sophia hadn't inherited a supernatural power. She had inherited something far more profound: the capacity to love unconditionally, to believe without reservation, and to share that belief in a way so pure it became contagious. That was the real miracle. In the weeks that followed, Leo's transformation was complete. He didn't just walk. He ran, he jumped, he climbed trees. The wheelchair was moved to the attic, not as a painful memory, but as a reminder of how far he had come. The boy who could only dream of running now lived that dream every day, proving that determination, fueled by love and faith, could indeed move the mountains of medical diagnoses and physical limitations. The resolution of the conflicts was deep and satisfying, bringing emotional closure not just for the characters, but for the very soul of the house, which had finally become a home. 6 weeks had passed since the day a little girl in a flowered dress and worn-out sandals first walked through the mansion's gate. The garden, once a silent stage for a lonely wheelchair, now pulsed with a life that defied gravity itself. The sound that echoed was no longer the whir of rubber wheels on stone, but the breathless laughter of 2 children racing under the late afternoon sun. Leo, his face flushed with effort and joy, chased Sophia in a game of tag. His movements were free, fluid, the memory of his motionless legs seeming to belong to another life, another boy. He ran not just with his muscles, but with his soul, every step a celebration, every laugh a hymn of gratitude. He tripped on an exposed root, tumbling onto the soft grass, but there was no panic. No tears. He just rolled, laughing, and scrambled back to his feet, wiping dirt from his knees before rejoining the chase. On the patio, Richard and Elena watched side by side, not as employer and employee, but as the proud parents they were. Elena held a cup of tea, the steam rising in slow spirals. Richard had his hands in his pockets, but a genuine smile, once a rarity, was now his usual expression. "Sometimes I still think I'm dreaming," he confessed quietly, his eyes never leaving the children. Elena smiled, a smile that held the wisdom of generations. "My mother used to say that the most beautiful dreams are the ones we live with our eyes open," she answered softly. Richard thought of the wheelchair, now stored in the attic, covered with a white sheet. It was no longer a monument to his pain, but a landmark, the starting point of a journey he could never have imagined. He realized that for years he had tried to buy a cure for his son, when the cure was never for sale. It had to be given, to be shared. Money had built the walls of the mansion, but it was a little girl's faith and a mother's love that had turned it into a home. He had learned that true wealth wasn't in his bank accounts, but in the sound of that laughter that now filled every corner of his life. The greatest transformation hadn't just happened in Leo's legs, but in his own heart. He had changed from a father who merely provided to a father who participated, who felt, who lived. Leo finally caught Sophia, tapping her shoulder in a triumphant gesture. "Tag!" he shouted, his voice full of breath and happiness. They collapsed onto the grass together, looking up at the clouds drifting across the blue sky. In that moment, they weren't the millionaire's son and the housekeeper's daughter. They were just Leo and Sophia, two friends, two siblings, the living proof of a miracle. Where there had once been the resigned silence of a stationary wheelchair, there now echoed the endless laughter of two children, discovering together that there are no limits for those who dare to dream and have the courage to love. The boy who had never walked finally understood the deepest truth of all. He just needed someone to believe in him as much as he needed to learn to believe in himself.